In 1989, 14-year-old Aundria Bowman vanished from her Michigan home. For decades, everyone believed she ran away, but the truth was buried, literally. Her adoptive father, Dennis Bowman, held the key to a dark secret. Today, we uncover how this long, cold case was finally solved. If you're into true crime and uncovering the details behind long, cold cases, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We've got more stories like this coming, and you won't want to miss them. Aundria Bowman was born on June 23, 1974, under the name Alexis Miranda Badger. She was placed into the foster care system as an infant and was later adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman. The Bowmans were a married couple living in Hamilton, Michigan, a quiet town known for its tight-knit community. On the surface, it appeared that Aundria had been given a stable home, but troubling signs would soon emerge. Dennis Bowman, a former Navy man, and his wife Brenda presented themselves as a typical middle-class family. But behind closed doors, life for Aundria was far from ideal. As she grew older, she began to share troubling experiences with those around her. Aundria confided in friends and teachers, hinting that her adoptive father was not the kind, caring figure he appeared to be. She spoke of physical and emotional abuse within the household, suggesting a deeply strained relationship with Dennis. In particular, Aundria had reportedly accused Dennis of inappropriate behavior, although it's unclear how many of these allegations reached authorities before her disappearance. This created a volatile environment in the Bowman household, and by her early teens, Aundria was feeling increasingly trapped and isolated. These tensions only worsened as Aundria entered adolescence, with her complaints and cries for help going largely unnoticed or dismissed. Despite these concerns, Aundria's life in Hamilton, Michigan was outwardly unremarkable. She attended the local school, participated in everyday activities, and was described by those who knew her as a shy, quiet girl. However, those who looked closer saw a teenager struggling to navigate life in a home where she felt unsafe. March 11, 1989 was supposed to be an ordinary day in the Bowman household. According to Dennis and Brenda Bowman, their 14-year-old adoptive daughter, Aundria, had been at home in Hamilton, Michigan, but by the end of the day, she was gone. Dennis Bowman told authorities that Aundria had run away. He claimed that she had stolen money from the house and simply left. The narrative was accepted at first without much question. After all, Aundria had previously expressed dissatisfaction with her home life and had hinted at the possibility of running away. This, combined with her age and typical teenage angst, led investigators to initially categorize her disappearance as a runaway case. However, this was far from the full picture. Aundria had, in fact, spoken to several friends and teachers about the difficulties she faced at home, especially her troubled relationship with her adoptive father. She had hinted at physical and emotional abuse, creating tension in the household that couldn't be ignored. Some who knew her found it plausible that she would leave to escape the situation, but others doubted she would abandon her life without a trace. When Aundria was first reported missing, the police response was somewhat limited, given the belief that she had voluntarily left. The Hamilton Police Department, dealing with a relatively quiet community, didn't initially consider her case a high-priority investigation. With no immediate signs of foul play and no hard evidence suggesting otherwise, Aundria's case was treated as a typical runaway situation. This meant there was no urgent search, no large-scale investigation, and certainly no widespread media coverage. Aundria's name didn't make headlines, and for a long time there was little attention given to her sudden disappearance. But there were people in Aundria's life who felt differently. While some believed that she may have left of her own will, others, especially those who knew about the tension in her home, had doubts. They couldn't reconcile the idea of Aundria willingly running away with the fact that she had left everything behind: her clothes, personal belongings, and any means of supporting herself. If she had truly run away, where was she going? And how was she planning to survive? These questions went unanswered for years. Over time, Aundria's case began to grow colder. The initial belief that she had run away meant there wasn't much investigation done in those critical early days. No physical evidence was collected, no major leads were developed, and the police didn't explore the possibility of foul play for quite some time. The lack of urgency in the early stages of the investigation was a key factor in why the case languished for decades. Friends and extended family members remained divided on what had happened. Some speculated that Aundria, troubled by her adoptive father's behavior, may have run off in search of safety. Others were convinced that something far darker had occurred, that Aundria hadn't left voluntarily but had instead met with foul play. But without concrete evidence or a body, the investigation hit a wall, and Aundria Bowman's disappearance faded into the background of the small-town community. The conflicting narratives surrounding Aundria's disappearance, the idea that she had simply run away versus the suspicion that something far more sinister had occurred, would haunt the case for years to come. With no clear answers and little progress, Aundria's name eventually became a cold case, known only to a few local authorities and those close to her. For nearly 30 years, her whereabouts remained a mystery, and for many it seemed as though the truth might never come to light. During this time, Dennis and Brenda Bowman continued to maintain their version of events. They insisted that Aundria had run away and was simply out there somewhere, perhaps living under a new identity, far from her past life. But as time went on, this explanation seemed increasingly unlikely. Yet without any physical evidence or new leads, the case was left dormant with no breakthroughs and no answers. Aundria Bowman's fate was sealed in silence for the time being. Dennis Bowman, Aundria Bowman's adoptive father, initially appeared to be an average, law-abiding citizen in the quiet town of Hamilton, Michigan. A former Navy seaman, Bowman and his wife Brenda lived a seemingly ordinary life, raising their adopted daughter Aundria in a small, close-knit community. But beneath the surface, Dennis Bowman harbored a dark and violent past that few were aware of, and which would only come to light decades later. Bowman's history of violence stretched back to 1980, nearly a decade before Aundria's disappearance. At that time, he had already demonstrated a capacity for extreme brutality. In September 1980, Kathleen O'Brien Doyle, the wife of a Navy pilot, was found murdered in her Norfolk, Virginia home. She had been sexually assaulted and brutally strangled. For years, the case went unsolved, with no leads or suspects who could be definitively linked to the crime. Bowman managed to evade detection, blending back into his life without raising suspicion. Though he wasn't apprehended for Kathleen Doyle's murder for many years, Bowman's violent tendencies did not go entirely unnoticed. In 1981, less than a year after Doyle's murder, Bowman was arrested in Michigan for attempting to abduct a teenage girl at gunpoint. The girl managed to escape, and Bowman was convicted for the crime. He served a short prison sentence, but this incident was just one example of his escalating criminal behavior. Despite this, he was able to return to his community and his family, including Aundria, after his release, with many people unaware of his prior violent actions. One of the most troubling aspects of Dennis Bowman's history is how he managed to avoid suspicion in connection with Aundria's disappearance for so long. Despite the fact that he had a known criminal record, including the attempted abduction, and that Aundria had reportedly accused him of abusive behavior, he was never treated as a primary suspect in her case. Authorities leaned heavily on the narrative that Aundria had run away, in part because of Bowman's insistence that this was the case. His demeanor and outward behavior allowed him to project the image of a concerned father, even as the real story remained hidden. It wasn't until 2019, 3 decades after Aundria's disappearance, that Dennis Bowman's criminal history began to fully unravel. Investigators, following up on forensic leads from Kathleen Doyle's cold case, linked Bowman's DNA to her murder in Virginia. This breakthrough finally exposed the violent and dangerous man he truly was. His arrest for Doyle's murder opened the door to renewed scrutiny of his past, including Aundria's disappearance. The authorities now had reason to revisit the question of what really happened to her. The connection between Kathleen Doyle's murder and Bowman's involvement was critical in establishing a clearer picture of his criminal profile. Bowman had successfully hidden his violent past for years, benefiting from the limitations of forensic technology and the lack of interconnection between different law enforcement agencies across state lines. This allowed him to live relatively free of suspicion despite his history of violence. His ability to evade capture for such a long period highlights how, for many years, justice was out of reach for both Kathleen Doyle and Aundria Bowman. Bowman's criminal record, his history of violence, and the fact that he was able to re-enter society after serving time for the attempted abduction all paint a chilling portrait of a man who was able to hide his true nature for decades. He blended into the fabric of everyday life, continuing to raise Aundria without ever facing serious questioning in connection with her disappearance. The failure to initially connect him to her case underscores how easily he manipulated the system, maintaining his facade of a concerned father even as the truth lay buried, both literally and figuratively. Dennis Bowman's violent tendencies, hidden for so long, finally came to light when he was linked to the murder of Kathleen Doyle. This was the first major crack in the story that Bowman had so carefully constructed for decades. His arrest in 2019 marked the beginning of the end for his years of deception and led directly to the eventual discovery of what had really happened to Aundria Bowman. In 2019, the Aundria Bowman case, which had long gone cold, was finally revived due to an unexpected breakthrough in a separate crime. The key development came when law enforcement in Virginia made a major stride in solving the 1980 cold case of Kathleen O'Brien Doyle, a Navy officer's wife who had been brutally murdered in her Norfolk, Virginia home. For nearly 40 years, this case remained unsolved. But advancements in forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, brought new life to the investigation. A fresh look at the evidence from Doyle's murder revealed a DNA match to a suspect, Dennis Bowman, Aundria's adoptive father. Bowman had managed to evade detection for decades, but now modern forensic tools linked him directly to Doyle's murder. With the DNA evidence in hand, authorities arrested Bowman at his home in Allegan County, Michigan in November 2019. The arrest, nearly 40 years after Doyle's murder, was a crucial moment that would not only bring closure to Doyle's family, but also shine a new spotlight on Aundria Bowman's long-forgotten disappearance. Bowman's arrest sent shockwaves through his local community. For years, he had lived a quiet life with no outward signs of his violent past. But now, as investigators delved deeper into his background, his involvement in Aundria's disappearance began to resurface. Aundria had disappeared from Bowman's home in 1989, and while her case had been treated as a runaway, it had never been fully resolved. Bowman's arrest for the 1980 murder in Virginia led investigators to re-examine his role in Aundria's disappearance, which was never satisfactorily explained. Investigators quickly shifted focus. With Bowman now linked to a violent, unresolved crime, his proximity to Aundria's disappearance seemed far more suspicious. They began to scrutinize the 1989 events more closely, casting doubt on the original narrative that Aundria had simply run away. Questions arose. If Bowman had been capable of such extreme violence in the past, was it possible that he had been involved in Aundria's fate? Investigators began to reconsider the possibility that foul play had been involved in her case all along. As Bowman sat in custody, facing charges for Kathleen Doyle's murder, police reopened the investigation into Aundria's disappearance with renewed vigor. They searched Bowman's property and began a deeper probe into his personal history, uncovering more disturbing patterns of violence and misconduct that had gone unnoticed or unreported for decades. The cold case that had once been sidelined as a simple runaway now took center stage in a broader investigation into Bowman's criminal activities. Bowman's arrest in the Doyle case provided the necessary momentum for investigators to dig further. They re-interviewed people who had known Aundria and the Bowman family in the late 1980s, seeking new leads and insights into what might have happened to her. The disturbing nature of Bowman's previous crime brought new urgency to the investigation. Authorities now had reason to believe that Aundria's disappearance wasn't voluntary, but rather a deliberate and violent act committed by the man who had adopted her. The turning point came in early 2020, when Dennis Bowman finally broke under pressure. Faced with mounting evidence against him and the knowledge that investigators were closing in on the truth about Aundria's disappearance, Bowman confessed. In a chilling admission, he revealed that he had killed Aundria in 1989 after an argument and had buried her body on his property in Allegan County, Michigan. This confession ended years of speculation and mystery surrounding Aundria's fate and finally brought clarity to the case. Investigators were led to Bowman's property, where they uncovered Aundria's remains, buried for over 30 years. For her friends, family, and the community, the discovery was both heartbreaking and a long-awaited resolution to a decades-old mystery. Aundria had never run away, as many had once believed. Instead, she had been the victim of a horrific crime at the hands of her own adoptive father. The re-examination of Aundria Bowman's disappearance was made possible by the breakthrough in Kathleen Doyle's murder case. Bowman's arrest for the 1980 crime provided the crucial link that connected his violent past to the unresolved questions surrounding Aundria's case. It also underscored the importance of cold case investigations and how modern forensic technology can bring long-hidden crimes to light, even after decades of silence. In February 2020, Dennis Bowman finally confessed to the murder of his adoptive daughter, Aundria Bowman, 31 years after her disappearance. For decades, Bowman had maintained that Aundria had simply run away, a narrative that authorities and the community had accepted for years. But after his arrest for the 1980 murder of Kathleen Doyle, the pressure mounted, and the truth about Aundria's fate could no longer remain hidden. According to Bowman's confession, the events leading to Aundria's death began with an argument. In 1989, Aundria had been growing increasingly defiant, frustrated with her life at home, particularly the abuse she faced from Bowman. One day in March, tensions boiled over into a confrontation. Bowman claimed that during the argument he acted in a fit of rage, striking Aundria in a violent outburst. He said that the situation escalated quickly, and before he knew it, Aundria was dead. The details of how she died remain vague in Bowman's confession, but it was clear that her death was not an accident. Rather than report her death or seek help, Bowman made the chilling decision to cover up the crime. He devised a plan to hide Aundria's body, ensuring that no one would ever find out what really happened. After the murder, Bowman transported Aundria's body to the family property in Allegan County, Michigan. There he dug a shallow grave and buried her remains, confident that her body would never be discovered. In the years that followed, he continued to live on the property, going about his life as though nothing had happened, all while Aundria lay buried just yards away. Acting on his detailed admission, investigators conducted a thorough search of Bowman's property in Allegan County. Following his directions, they located Aundria's remains buried on the grounds, just as he had described. The discovery confirmed what many had long suspected. Aundria hadn't run away, but had been killed by the very man who was supposed to protect her. The emotional impact of this revelation was profound. For Aundria's surviving family members, the news brought a combination of closure and heartbreak. After years of uncertainty, they finally knew the truth about what had happened to Aundria, but the details were devastating. Dennis Bowman, the man they had trusted, had not only killed her, but had lived with the lie for over 30 years. The condition of Aundria's remains, having been buried for 31 years, made the recovery process delicate. Over time, soil and environmental factors had affected the body, but investigators worked carefully to ensure they preserved any potential evidence. Forensic teams examined the site thoroughly, and after several days of excavation, they successfully recovered her remains. The bones and fragments found at the scene confirmed that Aundria had been placed in a hastily dug grave. There was no sign of care or respect in the burial, only an attempt to conceal a terrible crime. Once the remains were retrieved, they were sent to a forensic lab for examination. Despite the time that had passed, forensic specialists were able to confirm Aundria's identity through a combination of dental records and DNA testing. This process was critical in providing legal closure to the case. The confirmation of her identity removed any lingering doubts about her fate and solidified the timeline of events that Bowman had laid out in his confession. Aundria's remains, once officially identified, could finally be returned to her family for a proper burial. The discovery of Aundria's remains sparked immediate reactions from the public and media alike. For those who had followed her case since her disappearance in 1989, the news was both heartbreaking and relieving. After decades of uncertainty, there was finally an answer to the question of what had happened to Aundria. The media quickly picked up the story, with local and national outlets reporting on the discovery, Dennis Bowman's confession, and the tragic end to a long-running mystery. The public response was a mixture of sorrow and outrage. Many were horrified to learn that Aundria had been murdered by her adoptive father and that her body had remained hidden on his property for so many years. The fact that Bowman had evaded justice for so long, living in the community and leading a relatively normal life, added to the shock. People in the local community expressed disbelief that such a crime had occurred in their midst without anyone knowing. The media coverage also reignited discussions about how cases involving missing children, particularly those who are believed to have run away, are handled by law enforcement. In the wake of Dennis Bowman's confession to the murder of his adoptive daughter, Aundria Bowman, legal proceedings swiftly followed. In February 2020, Bowman was formally charged with the murder of Aundria, a crime that had remained hidden for over 30 years. He was charged with open murder, a broad legal term in Michigan that allows the prosecution to pursue either first-degree or second-degree murder, depending on the evidence presented during the trial. In addition to the murder charge, Bowman faced additional charges of mutilation of a dead body and tampering with evidence due to his attempt to conceal Aundria's remains on his property. The legal process moved forward quickly, given Bowman's detailed confession to the crime. His admission of guilt, combined with the recovery of Aundria's remains, left little room for a traditional trial. Instead, Bowman's legal team pursued a plea deal, likely to avoid the possibility of a first-degree murder conviction, which would have been almost certain given the evidence. In July 2021, Bowman pled guilty to second-degree murder in Aundria's death, effectively sealing his fate in court. During the sentencing phase, the court heard testimony from those affected by Aundria's murder. Her surviving family members, many of whom had spent decades searching for answers, expressed their grief and anger. They described the pain of losing Aundria at such a young age and the deep betrayal they felt, knowing that her adoptive father had committed such a heinous act. Despite the emotional toll, Bowman remained largely unemotional throughout the proceedings. The judge sentenced Dennis Bowman to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Aundria Bowman. This sentence reflected the severity of the crime and ensured that Bowman would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Given the nature of the charges and his prior confession, there was no chance of parole or early release, marking a definitive end to any possibility of freedom for Bowman. However, Aundria's murder was not the only crime for which Bowman faced justice. In a separate legal case, he had also been charged and convicted for the 1980 murder of Kathleen O'Brien Doyle, a crime that had remained unsolved for nearly 40 years until modern forensic technology linked Bowman to the scene. In 2020, Bowman pled guilty to Doyle's murder in a Virginia court and was sentenced to another life term. The conviction for Doyle's murder added significant weight to the narrative of Bowman's violent past and underscored the fact that he had evaded justice for far too long. Bowman's conviction for both murders is significant because it illustrates the long-overlooked connections between his history of violence and the crimes he committed. In Kathleen Doyle's case, the brutal nature of the murder and Bowman's escape from justice for decades highlight how dangerous he was and how his violent tendencies remained unchecked. In Aundria's case, the legal proceedings served as a final chapter in a tragic story of betrayal and abuse within the family. By the time of his sentencing, Bowman had become a figure of revulsion in both Michigan and Virginia, with public sentiment overwhelmingly in favor of his life imprisonment. For the families of Aundria Bowman and Kathleen Doyle, his conviction and sentencing brought a measure of closure, though the scars of his actions would remain with them forever. Bowman's life sentences ensured that he would never again harm anyone, while the legal proceedings highlighted the importance of pursuing justice no matter how much time has passed. If you found this story insightful and want to dive deeper into more true crime cases, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We've got more stories just like this coming up and you won't want to miss them. Thanks for watching.